Hello everybody and welcome to episode 13 of AJTV. I'm AJ Soccer and I've been away for a while. Took a extended break from the game, but I'm back now playing GPs again, streaming regularly again, and hopefully doing these videos regularly again. We are going to be doing a match from Pro Tour Fate Reforged from this past weekend, and this is the quarterfinal match between the Hong Kong phenom Li Chan and Spain's Antonio del Moral Leon, who, spoiler alert, ends up winning the whole thing. But yeah, it's a really good match, and it's kind of funny because the last AJTV I did, which was 11 months ago, was also Li Chan. That time in his second Pro Tour top 8, now in his fourth, so he's been doing pretty well. And he's playing against the same deck, Splinter Twin, and he loses. Oh no, again! But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the lists. We're looking at game 3, so we're going to be post-board. With Antonio on the play. I'm not positive on the sideboarding because we don't have that information available to us, so all I can do is piece together what I can from what the coverage said about their plans in game 2 and what we see in game. So what they said Lee did for game 2 was adding the Revelry and the Molten Rains and cutting all the Boros Charms and 1 Helix. Yeah, that's not enough cards. I don't know where the other card is, but it's something like this. And honestly, I don't mind cutting the charms instead of helixes. I think the life isn't irrelevant, and the ability to tag a creature to not get comboed is pretty nice. But what I don't like is the cutting the Boros Charms and a helix over Skullcracks. In his interview, Lee said that leaving in the Skullcrack over the white cards is out of respect to Blood Moon, but I don't think that Antonio ever brings in Blood Moons in this matchup, like ever. And if you're worried about access to white mana by, being bottlenecked by multiple white spells and not being able to get them out at a reasonable clip, or maybe getting bottlenecked by remands or what have you, then I think a split is fine between charms and cracks, but to cut all your charms and leave in the cracks seems a little bad. Seems like you're downgrading your spells on the draw in a bad matchup for a little bit of value in a tiny, super unlikely corner case scenario. I don't know, it doesn't seem worth it to me. Another thing that Lee said in his interview is that he really likes Molten Rains on the play, but not on the draw. And I totally agree with that, because keeping the twin deck off of 3 is absolutely huge. So when you can outpace them, that's great. But on the draw, that doesn't work. They get to 3 before you, and then they can either play one of their creatures to tap your land so you can't even cast your Molten Rain, or just cast their creature in response, or what have you. So I really like that thing that Lee said. Unfortunately, he doesn't abide. He actually has the Molten Rains in for game 3, as we'll see. And that's another choice that I don't necessarily agree with, but move on over to Antonio's list. The coverage said what he did was brought in the Spellskites, the Dispel, the Negate, the Pyroclasm, and the Anger of the Gods. And what he cut was the Peak, the Cryptics, and the Electrolyzes, as well as a Stomping Ground. Now, I actually think it's pretty cool to cut a land here. For a lot of matchups, you're going to have to play a lot of lands, the games go long, and you need to be able to double and triple up on threats, cast multiple spells in a turn to protect your combo. This is not one of those matchups, so cutting the land is fine, and obviously Stomping Ground is your worst land. What I don't necessarily agree with is the Anger of the Gods. It doesn't seem terrible to me, but when you're not bringing in a Flame Slash, which he very well might have been and coverage just messed up, but when you're not bringing in the Flame Slash and you're cutting Electrolyzes, I'm not sure that Anger is better than either of those cards. It's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to kill multiple creatures with it. The third damage of the Anger versus the Electrolyze only matters with Swift Spear that can be prowessed, which is pretty unlikely. And then the Electrolyze is an instant, it draws a card, it can, go to the dome, cycle late, and the Flame Slash is just super cheap. So, not completely sold on the Anger, but it's possible that coverage just got it wrong and he didn't even do that anyway, so no reason to harp on it. Let's get to the game. Antonio, on the play, he keeps 5 lands, Bolt, Serum Vision. Fine hand, not great, but better than a 6. Lee, on the draw, kept 3 lands, Lavamancer, Bolt, and double Skullcrack. The Scalding Tarn lead is to hold the Bolt up against the Goblin Guide. But Lee's play is Lavamancer. So Antonio's just going to get a Steam Vents, and we can speed up the game a little. Oh my god, technology. If I actually hit the right button. There we go. There you get a look at his hand. And Antonio's going to untap and play his Serum Visions after drawing Exarch for turn. And he's going to see Flame Slash, Dispel. Now he pretty much immediately tops them both. Coverage was saying that, there's no way he would top, especially not that quickly without a Splinter Twin. But his hand is so mana heavy that really he just wants any spells. Anything that does anything. And it turns out Dispel and Flame Slash are anythings that do anything. The first real decision point comes up here. Plays a Sulphur Falls, and Lee attacks with the Grim Lavamancer, and Antonio just takes one. He doesn't bolt it, which may seem like he's just taking 1 damage for no reason, because he's going to Lightning Bolt it anyway. But remember that the Flame Slash is on top of his library, and he would much rather take 1 here, Flame Slash the Lavamancer, and then have the Bolt later for a haste creature, save 2 damage. So he's like investing. It's a down payment of a life to prevent 2 later. But it doesn't work out that way because Lee's follow-up plays a second Lavamancer, at which point Antonio just uses the Bolt anyway. So now that the Bolt is gone, you don't have to hold that up anymore. There's little harm in playing Exarch into the Flame Slash, which is what he does. The Exarch's in play, it's ready to tussle, possibly saves you mana down the road. The downside being that you no longer have access to its trigger, which may or may not come in handy later. But Antonio very much plays this deck and this matchup like it's, a blue-red control deck that really turns a corner and starts racing. So stylistically, playing the Exarch makes sense, but I think I would have held it if I were in his seat. I think that tapping a creature or a land on a key turn down the road is going to be worth more to me, especially with the Dispel on top of my library. I'm going to want that in hand before my Exarch's in play. Might have some value. And sure enough, Goblin Guide is one of the continuations where Exarch being in hand would save damage, but Lee didn't have that before. It was obviously drawn, so It's not clear that playing the Exarch is wrong. I think it's just a stylistic thing. And Lee actually made a small mistake. I say small mistake, but he played the wrong land that turn. He played his Arid Mesa. The problem with Arid Mesa is it's his only fetch left. He has a basic mountain in hand. And the Arid Mesa, there's a little life total discrepancy here. The Arid Mesa has to find Stomping Ground because he needs the green for any destructive revelries he draws. But he also wants to cast Skullcrack this turn. So in order to do both, he has to pay 2 life to the Stomping Grounds. And I think that that's not worth it. I would have preferred to see Lee just play the mountain if he's going to Skullcrack. And actually, after he plays the fetch, I would just fetch and put the Stomping Ground into play tapped. I really think the 2 life is not worth it. The game isn't going to come down to, you know, using all your cards fast enough. It's more likely to end up that the 2 life matters. Also worth noting is that he's cast the Skullcrack and has another one in hand. One or both of those could be Boros Charm or potentially Lightning Helix, either of which would be much, much better here. So Goblin God attacks and gives Antonio a mountain. Exarch's not blocking, so might as well be attacking. And here, we're going to pause and move screens because Antonio has some options. He drew Snapcaster Mage for the turn after Goblin Guide revealed a mountain. So this is the situation. What do you do here? Start by playing the mountain because it's the land Lee knows about. But I'll pause for a moment. Think about your options. This is your graveyard right here. Indicate that it's your graveyard while you think. Alright. You can pretty much immediately eliminate Flame Slash as an option because Lightning Bolt is just going to be, I almost said strictly better. It's going to be a lot better. Nearly strictly better because you get a Goblin Guide trigger out of it. I know that a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people is going to be to Snapcaster the Serum Visions, and that was my instinct as well, but I think that is actually going to be a mistake. The idea is you Snapcaster the Serum Visions and look to block the Goblin Guide. The problem with this is, first of all, you have to realize that card count doesn't really matter that much, at least cards in hand. What matters the most is card selection. Now, once you realize that, you can see that Serum Visions looks at 3 cards, essentially. A little over 3 cards, because you draw a card and then you scry 2. You're probably going to scry at least 1 spell to the top, and then the Goblin Guide is just going to look at a spell. Some small percentage of the time, you draw a card, scry both to the bottom, and then Goblin Guide reveals a fresh card, in which, you know, you're getting a little more value there. But what may not be inherently obvious is that Lightning Bolt actually looks at 2 cards here. The reason is that you're going to get a Goblin Guide trigger, and you have a fetch land in case it's a spell that you don't want. So you're looking at 2 cards instead of 3, and what are you getting in return? Well, you're getting your Snapcaster in play rather than a card in hand. Serum Visions, you draw a card, but then your Snapcaster is like looking to block and trade off with the Goblin Guide right away, and that's not really what you want. I would much rather have Snapcaster in play than a fresh card in hand. Reasons. First of all, plays around a new haster. If another Goblin Guide comes rolling off the top, then Snapcaster Bolt 1, block 1. It also plays around your Snapcaster getting killed. Say you Snapcaster Visions, then Lee can just kill your Snapcaster and get in with the Goblin Guide, because we're operating under the assumption that there we go. This little Exarch gets in there. Because you don't really want to block with it, you don't want to have to, protect it with your Dispel or whatever, and you want this Goblin Guide trigger. So, it makes sure that the Goblin Guide dies for sure, and then you have a 2-1, which can then, if it doesn't have to trade off with another Haster or get killed, it then gets to turn on the offensive, which is, after the Exarch hits down to 14, that's 3 power, that's a 5-turn clock, which is pretty nice. The last little bit of value is that the Serum Visions gets to stay in your yard. Now, the next Snapcaster can Serum Visions, whereas the next Snapcaster, if you Serum Visions, the next Snapcaster wouldn't be able to turn Lightning Bolt into looking at 2 cards, because this Goblin Guide would be dead, the game state would be completely different. Your next Snapcaster looking at a Bolt is a lot worse than your next Snapcaster looking at a Serum Visions. Yeah. So I think that Serum Visions is definitely the correct play here, that Lightning Bolt is definitely the correct play here, and that is what Antonio does. It may be tempting to Serum Visions now, but there's really no need. Not yet, at least. There's also, I guess I should also say, there's some argument to be made for leaving Exarch on defense and Snapcaster Visions, or even holding Snapcaster for Snap Dispel. This is less valuable because Lee knows about both these cards, so he's not going to let you be mana efficient in the near future, and I don't know, it's just passive and weak, and I think that a more forcing line is going to benefit you more. Which is what Antonio does. Another good thing to point out here is that when he drew the Snapcaster, he didn't immediately look at his graveyard, as so many people do, which would have been pretty, that's a pretty valuable piece of information, and I think that if he had and Lee picked up on it, he could just, not attack with his Goblin Guide, which would be pretty brutal. With Antonio kind of banking on this Goblin Guide trigger, if Lee was able to sniff out a Snapcaster, then he could just not attack, and it really blows up Antonio's line. But that's not what happens. It plays out as expected, and the Goblin Guide actually reveals a second Snapcaster, which is pretty nice. Antonio probably licking his lips at that, especially with that Serum Vision still in the yard. Sure enough, Lightning Bolt. And Lee just has to pass. And we go back to Antonio's turn. He does Snapcaster the Serum Visions. Unfortunately for him, he hits a land and then scries into 2 more. One of which is the Desolate Lighthouse, aka the Loot House. But it's just too slow, and Antonio knows it, so he puts it along with the other land on the bottom. And a pretty interesting, this is a really critical sequence that happens on end of turn right here. Slow it back down to normal speed. Lee with a hand of Bolt Bolt Revelry throws a bolt at Antonio's head on end step. And Antonio immediately dispels it rather than go into 5. kind of insane. My first instinct when I was watching this live was just that both players were making clear mistakes. Like, Lee is cutting himself off of options for pretty much no gain, and Antonio is using his only piece of protection, in fact his only spell, to stay at 8 rather than 5. It didn't really make sense to me until I rewatched it, and even then it took a minute, because my first instinct is, let's go back over to Lee's deck list. My first instinct is to look at all of the things that are better than a lightning bolt to your head to counter. Alright? Lots of things. A destructive revelry on a twin that you draw. Even like a later bolt that has to go to a creature might be better. It's easy to say, look at all these things that are better than a bolt to your dome you'd rather save the Dispel for. But then you look at the other side of it, of things that can't be dispelled, and you start to see why it makes sense. Lava Spike, Rift Bolt, and Molten Rain. The creatures aren't as relevant because Antonio's board is so good, but the sorceries are significant. Any combination of these, of two of these cards, except for double Molten Rain, is lethal if Antonio just casually goes to 5. And dying with a Dispel in hand would be pretty unfortunate. But staying at 8 life makes it pretty hard to die, and a clock that is currently 3 turns, but could easily become 2, seems pretty nice, and it seems enticing to maintain the status quo rather than risking dying to a fairly likely sequence of cards. So, upon further inspection, I like Antonio's use of Dispel. But what about Lee's use of the Bolt? Well, his hand is Bolt Bolt Revelry, and the crucial piece of information to note here is that he knows about Antonio's Dispel. A Goblin Guide, mapped it out after Antonio strided to the top all the way back on Lee's 3rd turn. And with knowledge of Dispel, bolting makes a lot more sense, because if he dispels the bolt, then great, Revelry is live, and you're good to go. You got, a pretty good exchange. If he doesn't, then the second bolt would force a Dispel for fear of dying to a sorcery, and Revelry would be live. Since Lee can't cast both bolts and something he draws, or potentially hold up Revelry next turn, he throws the bolt at Antonio on end step because he can and has the mana. So that makes sense, I like it. The interesting question I have here is, if Antonio had let the first bolt resolve, would the second one have followed? And that's pretty interesting. I don't know. I'm inclined to say yes, but I'm not positive. He might hold it in case he needs to kill a Snapcaster, but the game could play out in a couple different ways from there. But instead it just goes Bolt Dispel. And now that Dispel is out of the way, Lee is looking at hopefully 3 more draw steps, with an opponent at theoretical 5 life, 8 holding a bolt. So he's looking at, hitting running burn spells, 2 of 3 burn spells, or to have his opponent cast the Splinter Twin to turn on his Revelry, in which case Lee would only need 1 burn spell in addition to the Revelry, but would only have 2 draw steps instead of 3 in order to do it, because the 1 extra point would change the clock. Instead he draws an Eidolon, which, in all of these situations, by the way, he needs Antonio to brick off pretty hard, so it's definitely not good for Lee, but he draws an Eidolon and casts it, this is just Grizzly Bear looking to block a Goblin Piker. He's too far behind to not trade, but he's not quite low enough on life that Antonio can just not attack into it, so it's just gnashing here. And it might seem like Antonio misses a point here, with the Exarch not getting in there. But if he alphas, if he all outs, Lee could potentially block the Exarch, attack back for 2, and then Antonio would be at 6 life, which is range of 2 bolts. Lee would be at 7, more than enough life to cast 2 bolts, or 2 3-damage spells, I should specify, through his own Eidolon, and that's just the stupid way that Antonio could die. So leaving back his Exarch is correct. And he passes the turn. Lee draws a fetch here and plays it. Super speed. You can't even tell that it's in fast motion. Oh my god. Tank, 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 tank. Alright. Lee plays a fetch land and passes. And Antonio draws Splinter Twin. Now things are interesting. As it played out, if Antonio just held his Dispel this whole time, he would win, but he would have risked dying to sorceries. On the other hand, if Lee hadn't cast the Dispelled Bolt in the first place, he would have double Bolt in addition to the Revelry for the Exarch. That would leave both players in top deck mode, with Antonio having a slight life edge, 6 to 8, and a 2-1 in play. The Snapcaster still in play, with both players effectively hellbent, but Lee would draw first. So that's one way the game could have played out. There's also an alternate universe where Antonio realizes that Lee has had multiple cards in hand for multiple turns and just hasn't done anything, just passed over and over with mana up turn after turn. He clearly drew a Scalding Tarn this last turn because he played it, and Antonio could have deduced that there was a very high likelihood that Lee had a Destructive Revelry, and therefore doesn't cast Twin, instead just attacks with both his creatures and goes for his 3-turn clock as is. And then he's drawing to a huge portion of his deck to win outright with Twin through a Revelry. We can actually take a look at that. Depending on, the exact sideboard plan he used, any of the rest of these would do it, as well as another Snapcaster, the third Snapcaster for the Dispel in the yard. The Vendilion might have done it if he had enough time. Remand does it because Lee only has 1 green source. Spell Snare does it because Destructive Revelry costs 2. And Negate does it, as well as the other Dispel from the board. So a huge, huge portion of his deck to win outright. He's giving up drawing potentially another Splinter Twin as an out, but clearly, straight up math, it's all else aside, that's a pretty easy call. Plus, he has lethal in 3 at 8 life and can potentially lock out one of Lee's cards if it is a Destructive Revelry, essentially gaining 2 life, which is pretty valuable when you're at 8 effective 5, though he doesn't know that. But in that universe where he doesn't cast Twin, it's possible that the cards that Lee's holding are just, his pair of Shard Volleys or something similar, and then he could lose to a top deck rather than just combo him out, or at least exhaust his resources, make Lee spend all of his cards killing your Exarch, and then winning with Snapcaster and whatnot. In any of these universes, the game is just razor close, but in this universe, Revelry tags the Twin, and nugs Antonio for 2, down to 6. And then Antonio presses for 4, thanks to the Exarch Twin, dropping Lee to 5. So he's at 5 life with 3 damage in play. Theoretical 2-turn clock. And there's another land-based mistake here from Li Shi-chan. He actually cracks his fetch here, which I don't like. He does correctly do it upkeep, which is good so that you can proc the landfall on a top deck Searing Blaze. But what happens if Searing Blaze isn't your top card, but your second top card? Then you look a little silly for having cracked your fetch. And at this point, it's not even clear that the life point that he's paying for that fetch is irrelevant. Sure, it looks like he's at 5 facing 3, so 5 and 4 are the same, but Antonio could easily have drawn another Exarch, say, and made that into lethal. So it's not clear. There's lots of different ways that the math could go. It's not clear that that 1 point is just completely irrelevant. Searing Blaze could be a draw. Plus, he had to get a basic here where it's possible that he wants a second Sacred Foundry in case he draws a Lightning Helix or something and needs to cast it through a remand to win a race. But instead, he does thin his deck on upkeep, and with Bolt in hand, and Antonio at 5, his draw for the turn is Molten Rain. One damage off of lethal! Right? Right? Ah. It's pretty sick. Having the opponent at effective 1. Not only is that Molten Rain supposed to be something that does 3 damage, because he's on the draw and is supposed to board it back out, but even the 2 from the Molten Rain would have been enough if even one of his Skullcracks that landed was a Boros Charm. So Lee not winning immediately right here is just all of his sideboarding mistakes compounded into leaving him a damage short. And they say Burn's not skill intensive. Come on. So he Molten Rains. Boop. Antonio goes down to 4. And he passes turn. Lead not winning, but instead passing the turn. But now it's Antonio's turn to make a mistake. After thinking for a while here, he only sends Snapcaster and knocks Lee to 2. He leaves back the Exarch to play around a Haster plus a burn spell, which may seem tempting, but it's actually a lot worse, I think. If he doesn't draw a Haster, then he can just use that burn spell on the Snapcaster and get an additional draw to, something that does 4 like a Charm or a creature or even a Helix. Not good. And even if he does draw a Haster, he can just play it on defense and then look to block the Snapcaster and get another draw at a lethal burn spell with the burn spell in hand that you're supposedly playing around. So even in the pretty small situations or unlikely situations that you're trying to play around by leaving the Exarch back, you're actually not even that much more advantaged. You don't even gain that much equity in those spots, but you lose a ton of equity in other potential continuations and far more likely potential continuations. It's a pretty complex, calculation, and I haven't run all the numbers on it, but I'm pretty sure that you're giving up a lot of equity by not attacking with the Exarch there. It seems like an emotional play to me to hold it back, because if you attack with it, knowing that you die to a Haster, and then they just draw a Haster and kill you, you feel stupid, but I'm fairly confident in saying that the math will support an Exarch attack there. So Lee draws Eidolon of the Great Revel, as you see, And Randy explains how it's an amazing draw that totally punishes Antonio for not attacking with Exarch. And then Lee just passes, and coverage is flabbergasted and goes on and on about how they can't believe that Lee didn't play his guy. But if Lee casts Eidolon, he literally loses on the spot. He would lock himself out of the game entirely. He's at 2 life. He can no longer cast any spells for the rest of the game without dying. He can't attack because the Exarch just perpetually blocks it. And the game just becomes draw go until Antonio hits another Splinter Twin or a Cryptic if they were in his deck and wins. Because Lee doesn't have anything that costs 4, literally cannot cast the spell for the rest of the game, would just lock himself out. Yeah. So, he can't cast that. He has to use Bolt on the Snapcaster. Antonio rectifies his mistake, doesn't make the same mistake twice, at least, and does send the Exarch this time. And once again, Lee gets this bonus draw that he shouldn't have access to, but Antonio was kind enough to grant him. But he just, without the lightning bolt, having to use his lightning bolt on the Snapcaster to survive, there's no real way that he can get out of this, especially with Antonio having drawn a remand, because all of Lee's outs would be white, Boros Charms that are in his sideboard, and Lightning Helixes that some of them are in the sideboard. But with only one white source, remand is game. That part doesn't matter so much, and the handshake. Boom. Game, set, match. The rest is history, etc. So, pretty cool game. Guess I can come back to the webcam. Pretty cool game. Hope you guys liked it as much as I did. I really enjoyed that game. I watched it a million times, and every single time I watched it, I was finding new stuff. Yeah, hope you liked my video too. If you did, let me know, because I want to keep making these videos, and that, whether I get to or not, is basically up to demand. So, you know, comment section below, go now, and let us know if you liked it or not. Thank you all for watching.